Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Now, following Jeremy's superb show yesterday, we have another son sharing his father's story, also an aviation-based one. Ralph Vart served with 258 Squadron in the Arakan campaign in Burma, flying Hurricanes and P47 Thunderbolts. Tony joins us to share not only his father's flying stories, but also his father's physical and mental struggles, as anyone would have flying over somewhere like the Arakan. I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Tony. How are you today?
Good evening, Paul, and thanks for having me on the show.
And just to kind of emphasize the fact that, in a sense, anybody can be a guest on World War II TV. You don't have to be a tenured professor at a university. You are one of those people that made that journey from viewer to guest presenter. So how did it happen for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in the war, sort of knowing part of my father's history as a youngster, Paul, but I latched on to you on your first D-Day extravaganza, which was a marathon just under 12 hours, but YouTube cut it off. It should have been 16. And off and on, I've watched it ever since. And since my father's passing, I've done quite a lot of research. I thought I knew a lot about it, and I realized when he'd gone, I didn't. So I've done quite a bit of research since, and I've put a document together for my kids and my grandchildren. So at least the memory will travel so far down the family line. I thought, well, why not tell more people about it? And hence I plucked up courage and emailed you. And, you know, I'm not a historian. I'm not an author. So this is an ordinary bloke that's worked in military fast jet development for vast majority of his working life. It's just my story about my father and one or two people he flew with, and just trying to spread the word really about the Arakan campaign and Burma more generally, because it still is in some respects. Things are improving.
But it is. And I think your message is very important. Folks, you know, there's no point, in a sense, any of you doing all the work into your relative if you don't share it with people. Because, you know, if you get hit by a bus tomorrow, folks, you know, the work may just end up on your computer and get thrown away by someone. So I always urge people, put it on a blog, do a Substack, do a World War II TV show, go and speak at a local history group. Just make sure the information is out there so others can learn from it. So with that in mind, I'll bring up Tony's slides. Folks,
so
there is a lot of fantastic information.
Thanks, Paul. So this is just the story of one man and one or two of the people that he flew with. I will explain the killed a few fish comment. And just as an intro, whilst I've worked in the military fast jet world development programs all my working life, since I've retired, I actually volunteer at a local Hangar 42, which is really a Spitfire museum in Blackpool at Squires Gate, which was an operational airfield during the war. And it's well worth a visit if you're ever in the area. And as part of one of our selling points, we have a small team working there. They're actually building a full-size replica of an Airspeed Oxford, because Amy Johnson flew that on her very last flight. She took off from Squires Gate and wasn't seen again. So well worth a visit in the area.
Super.
So that's my father. The photograph on the left is, I think, taken coming back from his training. So it's just as he got back to the UK. He's got his wings there and his stripes. But the photograph on the right, it's not brilliant, but I've tried to sharpen it up. That is when he's come back to the UK after his service out in India / Burma. And knowing him as I did, I think even though it's 3-year gap between the photographs, I think there's a few more lines on the face that tells you or hints at what he might have gone through. He was born to a family that lived on a very small holding, a very, very small holding near Darlington. And his older brothers, 2 of them, were much, much older than him. So he had a very strong link with his father, my grandfather. And he did well at school. He rode a few ponies in gymkhanas and the like. So he loved horses all his life. But after he left Barnard Castle School, obviously you see the photograph, he's there on the back row on the far right. He tells me he was quick over 15 yards. I'm not so sure, but that's what he said. He joined Pease and Partners, which is a very famous Darlington firm a chap called Joseph Pease in the 1800s made a fortune on the back of the railways and the coal industry. And he was a Quaker, and he was the first Quaker to become an MP. And hence Darlington Football Club, which is very close to my heart and my father's, are called the Quakers. My mother also worked at Pease and Partners, and I think they met before the war. Certainly they met after the war at Pease and Partners. But she always talked about Peter Pease, who was the original Joseph Pease's grandson. He was killed in the Battle of Britain, but she said he cut a fine dash when he walked through the office in his uniform. So my father ended up in 1941 there at Padgate. Him and his mate had talked about tanks or aircraft and decided, well, tanks might be a bit more hazardous than flying. So they both committed to have a go at see if we can qualify as pilots. I have no idea who his mate was or whether his mate indeed went through with it or qualified. So at the end of 1941, October 1941, he arrived in southern Rhodesia, which today is known as Zimbabwe. A local historian calls what they did as the Empire Air Training Schemes, which was in sort of Canada and South Africa predominantly. They were the first of the schemes to actually produce qualified pilots. Now, that only by a matter of days before Canada did, but it was an incredible feat that they achieved, really, because if you can see there that on the map, that is Zimbabwe currently, but the locations marked on where they actually built about 11 airfields for pilot training and bomber multi-engine and single-engine training of crews and ground crews. And they built it there. There was an airstrip near Belvedere, there you can see at the top, which is Harare area now, was Salisbury area, now Harare, and it's all been built over now. But they built it there because all that area there in the dark shading where the bases are marked was all above 5,000 feet. And that was felt to be really, if we're getting people in from all over the Commonwealth, which they did, it was above sort of mosquito area. So there was much, much less risk of people getting malaria. And it was South Rhodesia was like a semi-autonomous state, if you will, within the wider Rhodesia. It was run by about 60,000 white colonials at the time, but the overall population was well over 1 million. And they'd recognized quite early that there was going to be a threat even potentially to Africa. So we're very keen to engage and offered up, we will do this. And luckily, people back here in the UK, yeah, let's get on with it. And they got an initial investment of £2.5 million. Now, the guy that is really responsible for putting this, which was a big construction project in at the time, was an architect. So he was released from his director of works type role with the South Rhodesian administration. He was an ex-major military cross guy. And they set about recruiting a labour force to build these facilities. The unfortunate thing was the money we're offering wasn't really comparable with the money that a lot of the labour force were currently earning manning farms, etc. So they struggled initially to recruit the labour force. A lot of lads hopped it, but they managed to. But near the end again, a lot of lads thought, well, once we've finished building this airfield, we're going to be conscripted. So they scarpered again. So they had quite a few problems to solve, but they did. And in the end, over 8,000 aircrew were trained there. Nowhere near Canada's number, but for the size of the operation and the number of people that were available to run it, quite a success. And even after the war, whilst it didn't close to 1954, a lot of people who trained there during the early years of the war actually came back and settled in South Rhodesia. So the white colonial class, if you will, doubled in size after the war. So my father arrived there by sea, October 41. He did his initial sort of classroom work at Cranbourne there, as you can see. And then in January started his initial flying training, which was generally in Tiger Moths, and then right at the end, Harvard. So that took a couple of months. And then he progressed to the service flying training at Cranbourne, which was predominantly all Harvards. And once he'd gained his wings, he returned to the UK in 1942. So probably quite intensive. And has been assessed constantly, I guess. The only thing my dad mentioned about it was he had a relative in South Africa who was a farmer, and on a weekend off, he went to see him and stay with him. And he said this farmer, who was Afrikaans, I think, he said there's going to be trouble in this country after this war's over. And how true was that? I haven't followed that up. I'd love to find out who it was and what the link to the family was.
Just a quick question, Tony. Was your father one of those, what the books would say is a natural flyer, or did he have to work at it? Because I think the perception is most of it, it was, he was born to fly. But I've had as many shows where people say, no, it was a real, effort to get through it.
Well, I'll answer that question for this next but one slide.
Perfect.
Because it is a theme that runs through his service, like even up to before he flew Thunderbolts. I'll cover that.
Perfect.
These are two fantastic photographs. This was a sort of auxiliary corps that was established, the Air Askari Corps, about 5,000 people, and you can see there the aircraft ground equipment. I love it. The step ladders to sort of clean off the upper side of the Tiger Moth wing. But fabulous photographs. And they're whether my father's in that bunch climbing away, walking away from all the Tiger Moths, who knows? But superb photographs. But coming on to your question, Paul, you can see here, and for people, these are flying hours per month. I thought it'd be interesting to plot these because at heart I'm a numbers guy, and you don't need to concern yourselves with the absolute numbers at all. But what you can see there is the sort of light green at the left was the Tiger Moth flying, the Harvards, the sort of lighter lime greeny colour, then back to the UK, the dark blue at the bottom, then flying Masters before going on to the light blue, which are Hurricane 1 flying. Now, all through his assessments in his logbook, he gets average. So, and there's a number of categories, and they're all average. So not above average or below average, they're all average. So it looked like very much a month by month assessment. And at any one point you could get knocked back. So it must have been quite taxing. The hours, the cumulative flying hours on the right, I put on there just for interest. His first solo flight in the Tiger Moth was just 11.5 hours. Before he got onto a Harvard, he'd done over 69 hours. And by the time he took to solo in a Master 2, it was 236 hours. So, and then up to a Hurricane at 280 hours. Now, I don't know whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, but that's what he did. And we've actually had his logbook. We did it on an Excel spreadsheet. My partner was great on that. And it was right to the minute, and he'd done it with a pencil round his ear and probably a gas lamp, so absolutely.
My guess is that's a lot. I'm sure I've done shows where pilots train on a lot less hours than that. So I'm guessing that's towards the upper end, but yeah.
It probably is, Paul. I guess what I would say is this was probably got a well-established scheme with a large throughput of pilots who weren't University Air Squadron pilots.
Yeah.
If you go back to prior to the Battle of Britain, a lot of the early pilots were people that had some flying experience of whatever type. But this was ordinary blokes off the street. If they passed the aptitude test, this was a well-established sort of syllabus, if you will. Yeah. So then after flying the Hurricane 1 in the UK, ended up at OTU at Annan. it was another sea journey back out to India, which he got there as in, halfway through the year, out to Pune. So the other thing that struck me about it, Paul, you go from 130 horsepower Moth to 600 horsepower Harvard, up to say 1,000 horsepower Hurricane. Now I've never flown, but if I could drive a 100 horsepower car, I could probably manage a lot more powerful car to a degree, but I'd get myself in trouble very, very quickly. So that's and that, a pilot might tell me, well, that's it's a poor analogy, but that's how it struck me just looking at that. Out in India, where he arrived 2/3 of the way through 1943, I didn't know much about the campaign generally, but I found this, and this was a post-war symposium with a lot of veterans in, and I found this description, and I thought in many ways that sums it up. Distance away from home. My father had probably never been, until he went to Rhodesia. He might have been to Yorkshire, but he probably hadn't been any further than Yorkshire from County Durham. And that applies to whether you were an army lad or whatever. The culture change must have been enormous. Talks about the mountain and jungle terrain, which I'll talk about. The weather, which was very, very different to the European theatre. And navigation was quite difficult. And the distances compared to certainly the shorter distances, hopping over the channel after D-Day, etc., the distances here were much, much greater. So I thought that was a great summary.
Yeah.
It's not a great map, but I've included it because it shows quite clearly the big issue for the RAF if they were flying, say, north of Chittagong, Camilla, which is where they started, 258. You can see the red dot there, Chittagong. The yellow dot and the line that goes alongside it is effectively the Arakan. And that brown, which looks like a ridge, that's actually the Arakan low mass, and it goes all the way up through lower Chin Hills, and ends up right heading up north into the Naga Hills. Well, that was a big barrier. In a way, and you see this in a lot of other books, they talk about the Arakan being quite different because of that natural barrier to the Central Plain, which is the great big green area with the big rivers running up it. And that, at its peak, it could be certainly the Chin Hills, probably 6,000 feet plus. But even where the yellow dot is, there's a lot of rivers in there, and some of those smaller ranges were 2,000 or 3,000 feet. So if as they did more later in the campaign, flying over into the Central Plain, they had to cross that mountain range. And the problem with that is, with the Bay of Bengal on the left, you've got all the moisture coming off the Bay of Bengal, hitting that mountain range, and the mist and the haze was colossal. And even my father said at times you just couldn't see. So there was a lot of instrument flying, which is, and one of my dad's favorite expressions was, you always had to be beware a cloud with a solid center. And obviously he was well aware of what was happening over the hump, which were even higher mountain ranges. But to a lesser degree, they had that flying from the Arakan later in the campaign over to the Central Plain. So the climb, obviously you had the monsoon period, but even before the monsoon period, because of the Bay of Bengal and the rising Yomas, it had a microclimate all of its own. So it wasn't just the monsoon months were a problem. So talked about navigation, because they did a lot of flying at dusk and dawn. And when it was pretty dark, there were no lights whatsoever to see. And so you had to be very, very good on instruments. And at a push, it was celestial. So my dad said you had to really understand looking at the night sky, because that was your last resort. Not so bad when you can see the coastline, the Bay of Bengal, but quite a tricky place to navigate. And once you see all the jungle carpet in the Arakan, it all looks the same.
I like your British understatement of quite a difficult place to navigate. And we were talking to Jeremy yesterday about all the initiatives they had with the guidance systems back to UK airfields. You know, your father's dealing with none of that, you know, and all the distinguishing features you get in Europe. Okay, there's lots of flak and enemy fighters, but at least you can recognize, you know, harbors and bays and cities and highways and railway lines, and very little of that present in the Arakan.
Correct. And certainly a lot of the foothills of the main Yomas, all smaller hills, it made target identification really, really difficult. And to do it with certainty, you had to fly quite low, which brought its own problems. Because if you were flying at night down a river, they had the wires across between the trees. If you took a pot shot at something, muzzle flash, lads flew too low, blinded by their own guns. So yeah, it was difficult. And you talk about infrastructure. At 1942, after the big retreat, there were hardly any airfields. So you know, they were starting from scratch. When my dad got there, the big program was underway, and I'll talk about that. The last thing I'll mention with that picture there, tribal alliances and nationalism. If you had to bail out, it was luck of the draw. Whilst a lot of tribes, and there were over 130 ethnic tribes, and still are, not all were friendly. And obviously you had the national Indian element, army element, as well as the Burmese for a period of time. So it was quite tricky when you had to bail out. So these are a couple of actual 258 shots. So genuine. The one on the left is the Mayu range. So this is the small range leading up to the bigger range. So the Mayu River is in there somewhere. And this one on the right is a bit nearer the coast, where you can see the foothills starting to mount up, but then you've got a bit more of a plain around that particular river. So that's a bit nearer the coastline. So, but they're genuine gun camera photographs. This slide is a great slide, and I'm kindly allowed to use it by Yagan Pilisaretti, who's one of the instigators behind the excellent website RAF Commands. And this shows the aircraft holdings in the SEAC theatre from beginning of 1942 towards the end of 44. Now, what I took from this, and people can look at the numbers, is predominantly, even right to the end of 44, was the Hurricane was the backbone, and the Spitfires were appearing sort of beginning of 44 to take over the air superiority role. But the Hurricanes were there still in strength, and yet more Hurricanes went to Russia than went to the SEAC theatre, believe it or not. The other thing I would bring out of this slide is that build-up was largely due to Sir Richard Pearce, who you probably remember, Paul. He was in charge of Bomber Command before he got pushed out and Bomber Harris took over. And Pearce would have been there longer than November 44, but he had an affair with Auchinleck's wife, and Mountbatten had to move him. They did get married in the end when they got back to the UK, but it caused a bit of a stir at the time. Lee Mallory was going to take over. He was killed on his way out there in an air crash. But Sir Keith Park came in and did an admirable job 1945 onwards. So, but behind that build-up of aircraft, you can imagine the build-up of airfields and airstrips. You know, logistically, that was an incredible achievement considering where it was. Now, Dad, when he got to Pune, seemed to do more dancing than flying. So he's there on the right hand with a red dot over his head, looking lovingly at this girl with her back to us in there. I was amazed because that photograph was in his logbook. I was amazed when I got the Squadron records out that the dance is mentioned. But anyway, but he wasn't with 79 Squadron very long. It was like a holding squadron before he went to 258. Now, 258 Squadron were had a very brief flying spell in the back end of the First World War. They were reformed in November 40 there for UK air defence, as it says, but then they went, I think, the Isle of Man, so they weren't at the sharp end, but they were then deployed out to the Far East early 42 when they really were at the sharp end. And they were involved in, got there just before Singapore fell. They had to divert to Sumatra, Java, before they got to Ceylon. And they had a bit of to-in and fro-in out of Ceylon to Calcutta and back. But the bit that where my father came in was the India-Burma theatre, sort of from August 43 onwards, as did, because there was a corps, the old boys were corps who'd come through that fall of Singapore, Sumatra and Ceylon. But then there was a lot of new guys in, and quite a lot of them were Australian and New Zealanders, funnily enough. The squadron went through to the back end of 1945 before it was wound up. So they came out from Colombo to Camilla, which was a bit too far north, really, from Chittagong, because they were in the start of the campaign. They were responsible for protecting Chittagong, but it's about 120 miles north of Chittagong, so it wasn't by any stretch ideal. And they were running Hurricane 2Bs, or flying 2Bs, and they came out from Colombo, and the squad that was assembled there was about 260 airmen, including pilots and officers. And all they did for that first month was a bit of sort of recce flying to get to know to the area. But the aircraft were modded for tanks. You don't see many photographs with Hurries for tanks, but they were. They did do quite a bit of flying. We get on to September then, which is when my father arrived. And that's when they started operational flying properly, really. And you can see the map on the right. That's really probably early 44. It shows the sort of bus routes, as I call them, really, down to what became the Battle of the Admin Box area. And the aircraft on the right, that's the Caladan Valley. So the Caladan River running from south to north there, supporting the African troops there. So there were lots of, in that first couple of months, there were lots of strafing, small rivers. They did see some Japanese aircraft, didn't manage to catch any, but they were seen, and the Japanese Air Force was still active at this point. And they did quite a few initial night rhubarbs where 2 or 3 would go out at dusk or dawn trying to catch the Japanese moving stuff, generally up and down rivers in under cover of darkness. And whilst they were doing a lot of strafing, the main bombing was done by Vultee Vengeance bombers, which was an American 2-seater, and quite effective, to be fair. So it had a gunner in the back, but was mainly used for dropping sort of 1,000-pound bombs, etc. So Dad did his first flying there under supervision in September, October. And whilst it just started operational flying, they got a visit from Lord Mountbatten, funnily enough. And this was in my dad's logbook. And I know another pilot, his son's got his logbook, and it was the same photograph. So Lord Mountbatten visited with Paul Ritchie, who, if you recall the battle for France before Dunkirk, the RAF out there, Paul Ritchie flew out there, and he wrote a superb book whilst he was out there, more or less, called Fighter Pilot. Well worth a read if people want to look it up. And the lad I know, his father he escorted Mountbatten back up towards the Chittagong area. So they had a visit. Whether my dad met him or not, I've no idea. But they both had the photograph. So November, a good move, really. They moved to southeast of Chittagong, Doazari, which was much, much better from being closer to the front line, who by this point were starting to get ready for the second Arakan offensive. And they were starting to do quite a lot of rhubarbs up the Mayer River Valley and the Caladan River valleys. And a real plus point is the Hurricane 2Cs arrived during November. Unfortunately, they all arrived with armor-piercing bullets, but they were soon swapped for just standard ball or high explosive, which were much, much better for the kind of targets they were looking to seek out. Come January, they're starting to go to Akyab and Ramri Islands, which were down the coast, and they are supporting on a daily basis the army advance down towards Maya and that Caladan Valley. And it's a poor map on the right, but the three blue squiggles there are the three main rivers running up from sort of end of the Maya Peninsula and an Akyab Island. And as the army advanced, they had a spell of a few weeks, which was luxury, actually on a beach at Hay or Stroke Hove. So whilst the tide was out on the hard sand, they could actually land and take off. But that didn't last very long. This photograph is a squadron photo. My father's there, third from right with a red arrow, looking very dapper with his centre parting. And my dad didn't mention him because I'll come on to this. I think there was the squadron was the diehards and the veterans, and then you had the newbies, and they probably kept that kind of grouping because the chap on the front row, third from the left, was a chap called Doug Nichols, and I think my father probably owed Doug a lot, as did a lot of the other new lads, because Doug was. I'll come back to Doug. So yeah, but he was quite a player in terms of his leadership and his flying rate in February when the Battle of the Admin Box was at its peak. His flying rate was off the scale compared to my father's, and my father did about 35 flights under his flight command. So really a youngster. Taking his lead from a more senior pilot, and a very experienced pilot was Doug. And I
wonder what the kind of mood would have been in the squadron at that time, because the first Arakan there'd been some problems with it. It's not full into 44 and 45 and everything's going the Allies' way. This is still the period where it's a bit dicey. It's still up in the air, pun intended. And some of the guys who've been there earlier had been there when things had not gone so well for the Allies in that part of the world. So I wonder what the mood was like at this sort of time.
The only way I could answer that, really, Paul, is that there were a number of casualties around this time of this photograph. There were three accidents, and I'll talk about one of them later on. But there was one lad was accidentally shot down, which Doug was very, very close to. They'd been through a lot right from the Singapore, Sumatra, Java days. So I think it was quite tense. They probably weren't getting to grips with the Japanese Air Force. Again, there's records of going up but not being able to engage. So quite a big proportion were relatively inexperienced. So I suspect it was quite tricky.
Yeah. Thank you.
Talked about the Battle of the Admin Box. So this became in February a bus route. And you can see it there on the left, the aeroplanes going down to where that star is. They were escorting DCs, Dakotas, and you can see there 638 hours flown, and quite often some would fly low looking for Japanese troops trying to encroach on the admin box and the wider area where parachutes were dropping supplies, whilst a top flight would cover off any Japanese Air Force. So and then they might do a bit of strafing on the way back, but very, very busy period. And you read James Holland's book 44. It's quite nice to think, well, my father was in the air above there at some point during that month. Come March and April, the army advanced after the admin box, which was a success, but everything sort of stalled a bit. Japanese resistance grew and grew as the army slowed their advance. And there's one, must have been quite a frightening rhubarb, really, where Dad, at night, flew down the Caladan Valley over Akyab, where the Japanese had an airfield, and then flew back up the Mayu Valley. Now that must have been quite stressful on its own at night. And they were also attacking quite regularly the Butidang area with lots of the tunnels that people talk about in the hills. But unfortunately, or fortunately, survived it. Dad, he survived a crash landing. He was actually shot down. Now, this here is the official sortie report. There was 2 lads. They were asked by the army, or the squadron is asked by the army, can you supply a couple of aircraft to come and look for a gun position, which we can't quite locate, but it's causing a lot of issues. And the army had cleared a very short airstrip amongst the jungle foliage. So they did a recce the day before, decided, yeah, we can land there. So Betts and Vart decided the night before, they went and they landed there. And then with a bit more army guidance of exactly where should we be looking, off they went. Now, Betts was the senior pilot. Dad was flight sergeant at that time. And the way that my father articulated it, he was the bait. And Betts was flying at a lot higher altitude looking for the muzzle flash, the gun flash. And as Dan said, the first shot, cannon shells went straight through his front fuselage. And it does back that up. You're never sure about veteran stories, even though it's my father, you don't. But the official report does back it up. And he crash landed back at the army strip. He had to get down. He had his head out, the canopy back, but glycol and hydraulic oil all over the place. He said he could hardly see. And he landed it in a bit of a mess on this army airstrip. And the officer in charge of the army group there came out and sort of tore a strip of him at first. Why have you wrecked one of Her Majesty's aircraft? And he said, look, come out and just have a look at the damage. And then he backed off. So it was a night of, it might have been 2 nights. My dad had to stay there. Obviously, they knew where he was. Betts got back. The army did destroy this gun position artillery. But my dad said, what a scary night or 2 it was on the ground in this position. He said there were bullets flying all over the place all night. He said it was a real experience seeing what the lads on the ground go through. I talked about Doug Nichols. This is the man himself, Doug. He flew at the back end of the Battle of Britain with 151 Squadron. He got a confirmed shared of a Junkers 88, and he got a couple of confirmed and probables out in the Far East as well. But when my dad turned up, he was the flight commander, and as I said previously, he led a lot of the flights that my father flew on. So, you know, big credit to Doug. At the end of the Hurricane tour, he was actually promoted to squadron leader, and he was promoted to 224 Group headquarters as squadron leader tactics, and saw out the rest of the campaign. He flew all sorts in that role, and he went all over. He had a bit of a free rein, really. But post-war, he became a teacher, including out in Africa for part-time, and was a gliding instructor. And his son, Chris, who I know quite well now for a few years, he continually, like me, asked his dad, what about this, what about that? And Doug had always deflected the questions, really, and didn't really give him a lot of answers. They said, we need to write it down, Dad. And they thought, no, he hadn't. After his passing, Chris found in a box in the attic a load of photographs, and amongst it a lot of written work, but some Amstrad discs where he'd actually done a load of voice recordings. So he'd been on with it. He just hadn't told his sons that he was doing it. And what I would say is Chris, with the help of somebody at Montrose Air Station, have put this out as a PDF document. You can download it from the Montrose Air Museum website, and it talks about right from his early childhood in the sort of over on the East Coast, right through to Battle of Britain, and briefly on his sort of post-war life. And a lot of photographs are in it, are superb. I would really recommend people have a read of it. It's a superb document about a fighter pilot.
Brilliant.
So, yeah, really, really good. These are some of Doug's photographs. I do like that. Look left and right. ZT are there, belly down. Obviously sad there, funeral on the left. And the cartoon, as often many people in the services used to have a bit of humour, and there was a cartoon of them resting at Dambulla in Ceylon. The next biggest thing, and this probably had a big impact on both Doug to a degree, but my father massively, because whilst Doug left the squadron, a few months prior to him leaving, this chap arrived as CO. Lord Cameron of Balhousie, the guy, Neil Cameron was his name, Battle of Britain pilot, been out to Russia to help them with flying Hurricanes out there, done a spell in Egypt, and both Chris's recollection of what his dad said, and certainly what I heard my father say many times, is the words you see there. My dad said he was a real stickler, but he was tough, but well liked, and he was a true leader. And you can see there post-war, he was out there till the end of the Thunderbolt tour. He wanted to stay, but he got pulled back to the UK because he was on a fairly serious career path. He became Marshal of the Royal Air Force. He was Chief of Defence Staff. He got a life peerage in the end. His book, which my father has, and my father has all these, as his career progressed, my father collected all these press cuttings. I got the impression both lads would have followed him. If he said, we're flying over that cliff, they'd have followed him. He was that kind of guy. And it's interesting when you read his autobiography. He loved it out in India and Burma. He thought it was a great experience of his life. He probably, as I said, he wanted to stay, but couldn't. And the title of his autobiography takes its lead from the Squadron motto. But he had, even after the war, he had issues around leadership, in that he has a couple of paragraphs on LMF, which was lack of moral fibre. And he regretted a couple of decisions, was my interpretation of how he wrote it. There was one lad came to him and said, boss, I can't do this anymore. And he said, I got him off the squadron immediately, overnight. I couldn't let him affect the morale of the rest of the lads. And he said, I never heard from him ever again. I don't know whether it destroyed his career, what happened to him. And he sort of had that, did I do the right thing there? And then, and the opposite of that, there was another lad he gave a second chance to. He said, I could visibly see that he was struggling. His flying was becoming sloppy. He was drinking a lot. He gave him another chance, and he was killed on approach not long after Nick Statton talked about it. And he said that was a mistake. He implied he regretted that. He could have saved the lad's life. So that's the kind of problem I guess you get as a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be difficult today with our understanding of mental health in 2026, but back in 43, for a guy whose main job is being in charge of flyers, understanding the effect of flying on the human mind, it's beyond most of these guys. It's not their fault.
No, yeah. But the type of guy he was, I guess, Paul, and he called me Dad Farmer like everybody else did because of being brought up on a very small farm. My father had led one flight, and this was Hurricanes, so and Cameron often led from the front, so he was leading, and Cameron went in first and had bombed a particular hill, And my dad thought, he's bombed the wrong hill there. And my dad let us fly, and they bombed a separate hill. But when they got back to base, he saw Cameron striding out to him as he got out the aeroplane, and he thought, I'm in doodah here. And all Cameron said was, "Why did you bomb that hill, farmer?" And my dad said, "Well, I thought you'd bombed the wrong one, boss." And he said, "You're dead right, farmer. Well done." And off he went. So, he was hard but fair. The army had been on, well, somebody's bombed the wrong hill there. So, but that's the kind of guy he was. He was loved by all accounts.
Brilliant.
This was air fighting instructor course, July 44. So the Hurricane tour had come to an end. The monsoon were coming, and they were going to re-equip with something else. At this point, they didn't know what it was going to be, but they knew they were going back to India to re-equip. But in the meantime, my father did this particular course, Armada Road, which is near Calcutta. And this is where, on the right-hand side, you maybe can't see it, but on his sort of his theory on the ground, he's above average, but his flying is average. so
at least he's consistent. I mean,
he's consistent. But I knew that from him, having lived with him for 20 odd years. He was sharp with numbers, so that doesn't surprise me, to be quite honest. Conversion to type. Now, this spell, they went to Arakan in India, and at the time, they wanted to go on to P38s, the twin-engine Lightnings, primarily because with a lot of flying done going down the coast to the Akyab and Ramri Island and then possibly potentially onto Rangoon, they wanted the security of two engines because it could fly on one, so you could get home. But they were given P47s. So I think the reception was, and I'm not, the table on the right is, it's not a real comparison about this aircraft's better than the other, but you look at the max takeoff weights comparison, the Thunderbolt is double the Hurricane, empty weight, similar, and the power is, depending on which model it was, is at least, another 1,000 horsepower, if not 1,500 horsepower. So very, very different aircraft. And you can see here, these two photographs are in my father's logbook. My father there's in the left-hand photographs on the right, and they've just seen them and they're just having a quick look at them and obviously having a conflab. And he's there in the middle photograph on the right there with his centre parting. And whilst I say low cost and high cost, the Thunderbolt was expensive to manufacture, but that was less of an issue in theatre. Where it was high cost was fuel consumption. Compared to a Hurricane, it was very much high consumption, but air cooled, so it had an advantage that way. My dad loved them in time, loved them. And you only have to look at the Wolfpack's sort of Hub Zemke's autobiography about it in the ETO, was massively successful, even though there's a lot of debate about Mustangs and Hurricanes.
Yeah, I mean, the Thunderbolts have made their mark before the P51s come in. The P51s
correct
were the absolute game changer, but the Thunderbolts had been absolutely holding the fort and doing it really well until the Mustang came in. And it's interesting, everyone in the sidebar, as soon as we mention the name of an aircraft, be it Hurricane, P38, Thunderbolt, we've all got an opinion.
Yeah.
Because we've read books, we've seen films. At the time, new aircraft are an unknown quantity. I mean, your father might have read the odd bit in a Life magazine or Yankee magazine, but really they're getting these aircraft without that knowledge that we have of what these guys did. For them, it's just an unfamiliar thing that I expect they're suspicious of at the beginning because no one likes change.
Yeah, exactly. They must have thought this is enormous, which it was compared to a Hurricane, which had come from. But conversion to type, I would say it was managed with the minimum of incident. However, Some American pilots came out with them to give them a bit of coaching, but then they were on their own. And one of the things they told them was very difficult to pull out of a fairly shallowish to steep dive. Don't do it. Leave yourself a lot of room to pull out. It's quite heavy on the controls. And at this point, they were starting to get issues. What they didn't know really was compressibility. And on the early Thunderbolts, the later models had electric dive brakes and electric bomb releases, which made it a lot easier. But there was one brave lad on another squadron converting to type. He went into a dive from, I don't know, 10,000 feet. And there was 3 people at his funeral the following day, unfortunately. And so you had to be careful. Very, very different to a Hurricane, really. My dad had his own problems. So they just started to fly them. And this is one of the incidents I couldn't get very much out of him at all about. And he was somewhat sheepish about it. And he was held at fault, I think, for colliding with Warrant Officer Halsey. And my father said very little, but he did say it was about 500 feet. And I thought, well, that can't be right, Dad. How did you survive parachuting out of 500 feet? It's nothing. And yet when I pulled the records up 2 or 3 years ago, it's there in black and white. Halsey broke his leg, and my father he flew again the following day, but he said he was black and blue for weeks. He duly got his Caterpillar Club membership there, you can see on the right. But that must have been an experience. And he
must have pulled that ripcord really soon after getting out of their aircraft, because there are jumps at 300 feet in Normandy by paratroopers. That's static line. Their chute is being pulled open as they exit the sea. Your dad was defying the laws of physics and gravity by surviving.
And you're quite right. And that's why I was a bit skeptical, even as his son. But when I saw it in black, the only thing he said about it, Paul, was it was post-monsoon. So the ground around the airfield was like a swamp. So they landed in extremely boggy ground. And he said that probably saved both their lives.
Wow. Amazing story.
It is an amazing story, really. One of the Aussies that who started at the similar time to him was Jeff Honk Kevin. He was an Australian. He was there for all the time my father was there, and they were best mates, really. And they kept in touch right up until Honk passed away first. And Honk, after the war, done very well in business. He met my father at Royal Ascot a couple of times. He'd done that well. He hired a box for Royal Ascot and invited my mother and father down. And the state they came back in, it must have been some day, 2 or 3 days later. And he always wanted them to go to Australia, but they didn't go. They should have gone, really. But that's Honk. It's a photograph from the Australian War Museum. Sacrilege, but I had it colorized because I just think it looks magnificent. And that all the modeling aficionados love it with the checker band on the nose.
Yeah.
And you see photographs, but as soon as they went to start ops, it became the standard creamy white nose band. It looked too much at a glance, a bit like a Japanese. At the corner of your eye, you might see a bit of red and mistake it for a Japanese aircraft. Another guy that he saw something of after the war, but they lost touch, was Peter Stead. Quite famous in England for being an architect post-war. And I mention him because about 4 or 5 years ago, his medal collection was available with his logbook, and it was available for quite a while, and I ummed and ahed. And by the time I'd made my mind up, I thought, well, I need to buy this, really. It had gone, and it wasn't big money, really. So there was a regret there, really, because my father did know him. I thought it would be nice to keep it with with my father's really, but one of those things. So they've now converted to Thunderbolts, and much more offensive now, really. And even in December, they're starting to cross over the Arakan Yomas to go into Mandalay and Mektila area, attacking a lot of the initial bridges. Initial targets were bridges, and they're obviously there, knowing what's going to happen, trying to stop routes for Japanese reinforcements to come as the third Arakan campaign was about to commence. January 45, and this is where I really love listening to Lucy Bettridge Dyson talk about Hill 170. The squadron did multiple sorties in January leading up to that assault. They covered off Ramree Island, and then the Mark II bubble top arrived, which effectively didn't give you a huge increase in performance, but what it did give you was much better visibility with the bubble top. And that's the sort of typical sets of stores, sort of logistics wise, that they went through in that particular month. So quite a lot of 500 pounders, a lot of 50 cals, and for the first time they started to drop napalm. They didn't drop a lot of napalm, but they did use it. One or two aircraft had problems with it, and there was also in those early days they had a problem with a leak out of a tank right in front of the cockpit, leaking, and my father even he saw one aircraft just blow up right in front of him, different squadron, but it just blew up in midair, which I guess once they knew what the problem was, they took all those tanks out and sorted them out. But and at this point there was a real morale issue with the lads that were servicing, because in their wisdom, instead of moving as the squadron moved from one strip to another in the terms of a major move, not an overnighter, but the servicing crews would tend to move with them. Until this point, they made the decision, no, the servicing crew stay at that particular airstrip and service whatever comes in, even if the squadron that you've built all this time and relationship up with, even if they move on. And I'm not totally sure how that panned out, but I know it was a big talking, and it is a talking point in the squadron documents at the time. So, killed a few fish. So these are actual cuttings out of my dad's logbook, and you probably need to see it on a big screen there. But where the first one underlined is 2 near misses, killed a few fish, where he's bombing a bridge, and then killed a few more fish down at the bottom there. So you know that's the kind of comment was in his logbook. And what I sensed out of looking at his comments from the Hurricane tour compared to the Thunderbolt tour was he was a lot more confident, because he was leading flights by this point.
Right. Yeah.
And there was a bit of that humor in it, which I didn't really sense in the Hurricane tour, where he was sort of more the novice. So I thought, yeah, I'll explain the comment that was on the opening slide. He flew that one once. It's a very poor photograph, but he did fly that one. That's at Ratnap, where they did most of the flying from Thunderbolts. February 45, again, Kangor was a bus route, and a lot more flying over Mandalay, Mektila, and they had one amazing escort journey where it was the first time they'd really seen B-29s, and Dad did get up close to them, certainly where they were being unloaded and loaded at one particular base, and they said they were just amazed how big, and the kit that was going on them, said they couldn't believe it. But Cameron got a half share of a Air Force Tony, so they were still about Japanese, and I think that might be the last formal RAF claim in Southeast Asia during the formal war years. And they did have one hit Tazi, which is north of Mctila. So the Mandalay Mctila area is in the green box on your right there. Apparently, the haze could be seen for miles and miles and miles. It's 7,000 feet, it said in my dad's logbook on the previous slide. So absolutely huge blast. Coming to March and April, along Rhubarb, full squadron, Rhubarb down the Irrawaddy. That must have been some sight, to be fair. So 12 Hurricanes, 12 Thunderbolts flying down in the early morning. It's a bit, it's a bit like an apocalypse now moment. That really, that's how I saw it in my head. And they started using VCP, which was vision control point or vector control point. Vision control point, I think, was the formal terminology. And this was in the Mctila area. We'd call it now forward air controller. Yep. So a couple of guys, an RAF guy in a Jeep with a powerful radio, and the aircraft in a cab rank flying over the area, getting called down for individual targets. And this is where, again, when I read Jack Boucher's book, talking about Thunder Run, I thought, crikey, it opened it up to me, really.
I mean, and this is the era, and we've said this before on the channel, where the Allied ability to do successful combined arms is winning them the war. The fact that the Japanese now can't coordinate between sea and air and ground, but the Allies can. This isn't the Chindits of 2 years earlier wandering off on the road into the central plains of Burma. This is now ground assaults moving with air support pretty much consistently. They've got the logistics coming in. They've got supplies coming in. It's a very different war from 2 years earlier. So you mentioned your father's confidence coming across in his talking about and writing about, but also the fact that they're feeling that the Allies are getting better. You're part of a more professional outfit. Not that it wasn't professional earlier, but you're more successful is what I meant, rather than professional.
The one issue they found, and Cameron refers to this in his book, was when they first started this cab rank system, they'd say maybe put 6 or 8 Thunderbolts up, and whilst they're waiting for a target to be called up, the fuel consumption was ridiculous. So they started rationing how many aircraft. They'd rather get 2 or 3 aircraft up, attack multiple targets, rather than have a squadron of Thunderbolts up there burning fuel up, waiting. So, but the weather started to really set in way before the monsoons. So a lot of flying was done by instruments, even during daylight. And Cameron talks about leading his flight up through the Mayur Valley, totally blind, and he's on instruments. It must have taken some doing. They actually moved down to Ramri Island. They'd covered off the Ramri Island invasion, which was relatively pain-free in terms of the land troops. But they moved down there, and they were starting to get ready for Operation Dracula. So this was the move on Rangoon. He flew this one a number of times. This was at Ratnap, and he carried over. This is the one that was destroyed in his collision, but he carried N over into a bubble top. So different aircraft, but he still carried the N for nuts number. And there you can see the typical roll fits that they were carrying. And I've got those straight from the detailed squadron records. So they can carry a fair load, whether it's bombs, tanks, bullets, so they were quite a useful machine, to be fair.
Yeah.
They flew that one 7 times. Again, a poor photograph. It's in a number of books, but I am convinced that is my father on the left with his hands on his hips. I saw him stood like that many a time as a youngster, so I'll never prove it, but it certainly looks like him. But he did fly that aircraft. This was not quite the last page in his logbook, but you can see now we're in May, and the top where the orange bullet is there, that talks about the invasion of Rangoon. And the only flak they took, they were flying top cover, was from the Royal Navy. So they were fired upon by their own ships, but they did see the troops going ashore, and they did do a fair bit of strafing on the way back. Unfortunately, a few days later, there was a pilot who was killed in an accident. And then my dad had used up another of his 9 lives, really. On his 3rd from last flight, operational flight, a bomb wouldn't come off the rail on the wing. And all he said to me was, I couldn't get rid of it. I tried everything. I had to land. And it was luck of the gods. And it was a bent striker pin. It came off, but how lucky was that, really?
It's a reminder, as you said earlier, of the. It's all theatres, but particularly in that theatre, with the variety of things that are being attached to that aircraft on a daily basis, the different types of missions and sorties, the weather, the navigation, the mountains, the hills, the occasional Japanese aircraft, although that's now slowed down. The number of ways that a sortie can go wrong is off the charts.
Yeah, that was lucky, because any number of lads were killed on landing. If it certainly came off a centerline shackle, you got to be lucky to get away with that. But he got away with that one, and that was his 3rd from last operational flight. So once they'd been stood down, they were training for the invasion of Malaya. But they did, after the war had formally ended, they did the Madras Victory Flypast. So he was actually out but they ended up in Kuala Lumpur, as it happens, towards the end of 1945. And he got a lift back on a short Sterling, which took 8 days. But once he'd come back waiting for demob, him and a few of the other lads were just kicking the heels at Charter Hall. And he was desperate to fly a Spitfire before he was demobbed. And he badgered the CO, and the CO said, yes, do a refresher flight this morning, because they'd only done 2 or 3 flights in weeks. So do a refresher flight in a Miles, I don't know if it was a Master or Magister off the top of my head, one of them. And for goodness sake, don't prang it. And those are his exact words that he told me. So he did take it up. It was probably an old clapped out Mark 9, flew around for half an hour, put it down, and that was his last flight in service. But he preferred the Thunderbolt. So just stable on takeoff and landing on poor airfields, largely grass. He'd grown to love the Thunderbolt. The performance at high altitude was just fun, especially the RAF had ordered 800. The last standard didn't get delivered, but he flew the 4 standards before then. And he said the performance was just unbelievable at 30,000 feet. So that was the end of his flying career. Just to sum it up, and so he did 178 operational flights, 279 hours worth of operational flying, and you can see the breakdown there. But it's noticeable that you can see in round numbers, the flying time with Hurricane to Thunderbolt was similar, but he did it in roughly half the number of ops than the equivalent Hurricane. So just shows the longer range, carrying 2 tanks. The Thunderbolt was far more effective. And then another 609 flights, operational, non-operational, and training. So just over 800 hours in total. And I say, my partner did that on an Excel spreadsheet, and it was exactly the same answer as my dad's pencil. That summarize it by month. So you can see there the Hurricane, the light blue on the left, and the Thunderbolt operations on the right. But you can see even during ops, they're still doing training. And you can see there in September, October, November, that intensive training after they converted before they went to Thunderbolt operations, and the yellow are the monsoon periods in between, and the light green's the training course that he went to in between. So I liked it, and just shows me the intensity of it. What I would say is he was in the RAF for over 5 years, and he did just over 12 months worth of operations. I've done my partner's army history, and it's quite similar, and he was in a tank. So most of the time, they weren't actually fighting. But it's still stressful. There's still casualties in training, etc. But I thought it was telling that a lad in a tank, similar kind of relationship in terms of in front of the enemy as somebody in an aeroplane. Anyway.
Yeah, no, interesting.
Yeah, and could be completely random compared to other people's service experience. But you read a lot about people. Well, we have to keep the lads training to keep them busy and keep them out of trouble. So I won't go into this, but this is all the passenger flying he did from flying about the Southeast Asia. But I'd love to have talked to him about it, flying in a Beaufighter and a Mitchell and a Liberator. But I never got a chance to, unfortunately. This is his award for his DFC. It was delivered some months after he got home, and the postman delivered it. So there was no great homecoming as such, and he got a nice letter from the leader of Darlington Council there. So quite extremely low key, put it mildly. And talking about that homecoming, I never knew what it was like for him coming home. He never mentioned it. So, you know, VJ Day had long gone, so he got back at the back end of 1945. I've no idea how that panned out. Obviously, his grandfather must have been loved to have seen him, but I'm not aware of anything else around it. And all I know is my mother said for a couple of years he was so restless. He did go back to Peas and Partners, but then he left, and he had all sorts of little jobs before he settled down. And they used to go out at a weekend, as people did then, for a drink, bit of a dinner dancing. And they went to a place called Croft Spa Hotel, which is still there. It's still got a big ballroom. That had been next to Canadian bomber base Croft during the war. And so there was still a lot of servicemen there straight after the war. And my mother said they were all bonkers. They were on top of the bar, dancing, you know, that they were trying to wind down and decompress. But he did settle down, and he got a good job in the end. So, but his war service was beginning to tell on him physically to start with. So I must have been, I don't know, 10, 11. And he started to get a lot of pain down the left-hand side and tingling and thinking he might be getting a bit of paralysis. So he went to see the orthopedic specialist at Darlington Memorial Hospital. And he said, done some x-rays. Have you been in a car crash? No. Have you jumped out of a tree as a youngster? Or have you jumped off a wall in a big drop? No. He said, well, your spine's compressed. And my dad said, well, I did have a problem getting out of an aeroplane because he wasn't wearing his own chute. He was wearing a chute which was for a guy much bigger than he was. So it was slack. So when the chute had opened, he said the yanked up against his body. The shock was amazing, which must have been a lot of the bruising that he talked about later on. And the top and bottom of it, the surgeon said, yeah, that's what's caused it. And he had to have, today it's routine, but he had a chunk of bone taken out of his thigh and inserted into the top of his spine through his neck. So he ended up wearing a collar. You don't see many people wearing them nowadays. They probably do it sort of very keyhole surgery, but he did have a big scar on his neck afterwards. So this would be in the late 60s, I guess. But it didn't totally cure it, but it stopped it getting worse, would be the best I would say. But then sort of the mental side came to a head, really. I came home from school, and I'd be a bit older by this point, and he was on the settee, and he was literally babbling, is the best way I could describe it. And my mother said, look, your dad's ill. The ambulance is on its way. He recognised me. But then he was back in a Thunderbolt. He was back in the air for like 30 seconds, 40 seconds, talking to, and then he'd come back to you for 30 seconds and then he was back in the air again. So as a youngster, it was quite unnerving. And he went away. I'm not quite sure where he went. My mother was always a bit coy about that, I suppose, in a way. But he came back and he was on shedfuls of tablets, and he was for the rest of his life. And he had depression that went up and down, and he could never really get that happy medium. So when he was up, he was ridiculously up. When he was down, it was, oh, I'm not getting dressed today. I'm sitting in the chair. Life's not worth living. It was, and it was all after that. So I can only, he might have had that anyway, but I sort of firmly think it was the stress of the war years. It had some impact on him. You might call it PTSD nowadays, but certainly as a youngster, it was quite frightening to see your father like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Completely random, just babbling. And
the sad thing now is we probably know that a lot of people were dealing with it, but no one really wanted to kind of articulate it, because it would be like, well, everyone else is coping okay. Why would I be the one to, everyone had to do this. The whole nation went to war. Who am I to mention my problems? But the reality is that it was a shared experience, but no one talked about it.
No. But having said all that, he was a fabulous dad. They'd had a tragedy. There was a daughter there in the top picture. She died of meningitis a week before I was born. So they'd had to get over that as well, which obviously didn't help. But he loved his Darlington Football Club as I do today. So I've had 60 years of disappointing football, really, but it's my dad's fault. But he loved it as well.
That kills you. When you're not supporting a Manchester City or Liverpool, it's just years of eternal hope, isn't it? This will be the season.
And he was a long-time member of Darlington Coit Club, which allegedly is the oldest in Europe, and it's still there. And even I went down on occasion. So that was the only thing he really did. But he supported my footballing career, my brothers. He was fantastic. He was nearly he was nearly a sub at times. We were that short, but it had gone on as well. But anyway, superb from that point of view. This is a lot more up to date, and you might recognise one or two of the reprobates on there. So I was lucky. Bob
Lyman there,
yeah. I was lucky enough to go out to Kohima in 2023 with a sampan travel trip. So Rob Lyman to the left of the monument, the fabulous book War of Empires is a great starting point for anybody. The girl in the light green top to the right, Charlotte Carty, her grandfather was Bruno Brown.
Yep, I attended a lecture by her back in May, and I'm inviting her into World War II TV at some point. Yeah,
she's a force of nature. She runs
She is.
Bruno Brown led a retreating Assams. He was in charge of the Assams. They retreated out of Jessamine, got into Kohima, and they trekked sort of 70 miles in 39 hours under pressure from the advancing Japanese. And he was part of the management team that broke the siege of Kohima, effectively. And there's any number of people there have links with relatives, uncles or grandparents who served in Burma. So it was quite an emotive trip, really. But it wasn't the only thing I went for. After the trip, which was marvellous, around the Kohima and Naga Hills area, I ended up down in Bangladesh at Chittagong because I wanted to land on an airfield I knew my father had taken off and landed at many times, which was Chittagong. And I wanted to go in particular to the cemetery. And Chittagong is quite a bustling place, fairly chaotic. And I turned up with a guide at the cemetery gates, and before me was this green oasis of calm and beauty. That's the only way I can describe it compared to the bustle of Chittagong city itself. The cemetery manager opened up once he knew he had a son of a veteran, and he was his father had been an ex-Pakistan Air Force pilot. So I got the sweet tea treatment, and I was in there for an hour while he talked about his father's flying experiences. But the two lads I wanted to see and pay my respects to, as well as a number of Australians I'd committed to providing photographs for somebody in Australia, were these two. So Michael Nash and Peter Hicks. Now, these two lads, where that orange big dot is, they were killed. They collided They'd been covering off liberators refueling at Dozari. And whilst it said killed shortly after takeoff, Doug Nichols had a view, and it's in his book, that maybe they took one or two liberties with each other, and should have been a bit more sensible about it. So very, very sad. But then my dad took off an hour later, when probably the two aircraft wreckages was still being sifted through. So I wanted to pay my respects for those two lads. And Doug Nichols, who didn't fly this particular day, he got a ground crew to go out to the crash sites, and he got them to pick out Michael Nash's control column from his Hurricane, and he brought that back to England, and his son Chris now has that in the family. So quite a moving memento, but quite a sad memento in a way. Needn't have happened. And I talked about this with Chris, son of Doug, many times. We sort of know what they did, but we don't really know how they felt. And both of them gave very, very limited information out. We don't really know how they felt about friends or colleagues. We don't know about taking lives, probably some innocent. I don't know very much about my dad bailing out. Doug bailed out in Sumatra, so he talks a bit about what he went through. I'm not too sure. My dad didn't particularly go in for reunions after the war, so I'm not sure what the relationship with the ground crew, the others, were. And we certainly don't know how they cope with stress and tension and R&R. I once made the mistake of asking my dad, well, what about girls? And he just laughed and walked off. So I didn't get an answer at all. So not a clue. So it was quite liberating talking to Chris that his father was very, very similar. This was a roll of honor. I won't go through this at all, but they weren't all flyers. There's a lad at the bottom who I did visit his grave when we were in Calcutta on the Kohima trip. He was a radar lad, and he was killed in a mob attack by a mob in Calcutta. So the circumstances behind that, I don't know. So they weren't all flyers, but all those lads lost their lives whilst my dad was with the squadron. Some had been taken prisoner of war earlier, but they all died whilst my dad was serving with the squadron. And this is the last slide, really, and it's a colorized one, so apologies for that, but I think it's done very well. And it's the only one I could find of out in the Far East of a Hurricane 2C and a P47D. Okay, the Thunderbolts American, but this was at Palel. This is in the Imphal Plain. So this was in early 1945. So I just wanted to finish on that, really. That, just that brought it all back to me. That when I saw that.
Great to see, to us to be reminded, because I think most people watching, we think Thunderbolts, we think the ETO, we think escorting the 8th Air Force, and I think with the Hurricane, we think Battle of Britain, certainly we think the North Africa, but I think most people wouldn't be immediately thinking of Burma and the Arakan for where these aircraft were. So it's good to be reminded that most aircraft got to most theaters. So thank you very much.
Yeah, so that's why I like the photograph. Exactly that reason, Paul. Yeah. The only thing I'll say to end it, really, is because we're about out of time now. My interest was piqued. My dad took me to an air show at Finningley, and so I was about 9. So he's starting to take me to one of the early air shows, and they didn't have health and safety as they have now. So this Hurricane with an RAF pilot in landed, and he pulled up, taxied up right in front of us, and it was just those thin wooden stakes, and it was only about 10 yards away, which they wouldn't do it like that now. And the pilot climbed out, and he saw my dad, who always generally wore his RAF tie, and the pilot made a beeline for my dad. And for 10 minutes, even though there's a lot of people around us, the pilot and my dad had this conversation that it was way above my understanding at that age. But when the pilot walked off, they shook hands and he walked off. And I said to Dad, so as a young kid, could you fly that Hurricane now? And he said, and he was quite a modest man. He wasn't loud. He wasn't brash. He said, yeah, I think so. And he said, I said, well, would you not have to practice in something like a Cessna or something? And he said, no, I don't think so. And it was only then I realized that what had starting to dawn on me, what an experience flying had been for him. You know, so yeah, he would have been confident of jumping in sort of 20 years later. And I guess it's drummed into you with the training, isn't it? Yeah. So that's it really, guys.
Brilliant stuff. I mean, the most of the questions you kind of answer them as you went along, but there is one from Darren Little, whose grandfather was out there with 3 Commando Brigade. He says, were the squadron ever at Bilaspur, Tulahal, Morney, Bayan, or Mingaladon? 267 were based at those airfields during their time. That's where, were they ever there, your dad's unit?
They don't ring any bells at all, those,
okay.
Darren.
No problem.
No,
well,
I'm fairly confident, no.
Okay, and there's a couple of the bits of praise for you. Graham said, I enjoyed the way you moved from your father's story to the broader issues. Tony, thank you. Your daughter, Rebecca, great presentation, Dad, an interesting watch.
The 5 is in the post, Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks, Tony and Woody, for what has been an amazing show. And Fraser, fantastic presentation. I feel privileged that you've shared your dad's story with us. Thank you, Tony. And folks, again, if you've got your grandfather's story, your great aunt's story, your whatever it is, relative story, just your next door neighbor's story, and it hasn't been shared, do think about getting in touch and sharing it with us. And folks, we're back again tomorrow, but we're earlier. We're talking about India and its kind of civilian impact of World War II. Looking forward to that one. So help me get over that hump again to 100,000 subscribers. It means a lot to me if you're subscribed. So we're getting new subscribers every day, but a few more will get us over that. But Tony, it's been fantastic talking to you. Brilliant presentation.
Thanks, Paul.
It feels like you've been doing it for ages. This kind of first time, you feel like you've done this 100 times before. We're impressed by your professionalism. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the invite, Paul. Thank you.
Cheers then. So see you tomorrow, folks. This is Paul Woodadge from World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Bye.